Hello everyone, today we'll be talking about anatomy of the eye. The eyeball. Each eyeball is a cystic structure kept distended by the pressure inside it. The shape of the eyeball, although generally referred to as a globe, the eyeball is not a sphere but an oblate spheroid. Poles. The central point on the maximal convexities of the anterior and posterior curvatures of the eyeball is called the anterior and posterior pole respectively. So this is a diagram showing the gross anatomy of the eyeball. Equator of the eyeball, it lies at the midplane between the two poles. You can see on the diagram there is anterior and posterior pole, and then in between the two poles is where the equator lies. So dimensions of an adult eyeball. Anterior-posterior diameter is 24 mm, horizontal diameter is 23.5 mm, vertical diameter is 23 mm, circumference is 75 mm, volume is 6.5 ml, and weight is 7 grams. So coats of the eyeball. The eyeball comprises 3 coats. Outer coat, which is known as the fibrous coat, middle coat, which is commonly known as the vascular coat, and inner coat, which is known as the nervous coat. So we need to know what structures comprise the outer, middle, and inner coat. So let's talk about the outer coat, which is also known as the fibrous coat. The fibrous coat is a dense, strong wall which protects the intraocular contents. Anterior 1/6 of this fibrous coat is transparent and is called cornea, and posterior 5/6 is the opaque part which is called sclera. Cornea is set into the sclera like a watch glass. Junction of the cornea and sclera is called limbus. Conjunctiva is firmly attached at the limbus. So the second coat, which is known as the vascular coat or the uveal tissue, it supplies nutrition to the various structures of the eyeball. It consists of 3 parts from anterior to posterior, which are iris, ciliary body, and choroid. Then nervous coat, which is the innermost coat, comprised of the retina. It is concerned with visual functions and projects to the visual cortex through the visual pathway. So segments and chambers of the eyeball. The eyeball can be divided into 2 segments, anterior and posterior. Anterior segment. Anterior segment includes crystalline lens, which is suspended from the ciliary body by zonules, and structure anterior to it. Iris, cornea, and 2 aqueous humor fill spaces, anterior and posterior chambers. So anterior chamber. Anterior chamber is bounded anteriorly by the back of the cornea and posteriorly by the anterior surface of iris and part of ciliary body. The anterior chamber is about 2.5 mm deep in the center in normal adults. It is slightly shallow in hypermetropes and deeper in myopes, but is almost equal in the 2 eyes of the same individual. It contains about 0.25 ml of the aqueous humor. It communicates with posterior chamber through the pupil. It's a triangular space containing 0.06 ml of aqueous humor, which is bounded anteriorly by the posterior surface of iris, part of ciliary body, posteriorly by the crystalline lens, and its zonules, and laterally by the ciliary body. That was the posterior chamber, the last point. Then posterior segment. It includes the structures posterior to lens, vitreous humor, a gel-like material which fills the space behind the lens, retina, choroid, and optic disc. So let's look at the same diagram again. So the first coat that we called was the outer fibrous coat, comprises of the cornea and the sclera, so we can see in the diagram. Then the second coat comprises of the iris, ciliary body, and the choroid, and then the innermost layer comprises of the retina. Then you can see the anterior chamber, which is right anterior to the iris, and you can see the posterior chamber, which is posterior to the iris. Visual pathway. Each eyeball acts as a camera. It perceives the images and relays the sensation to the brain. occipital cortex via the visual pathway, which comprises of the optic nerves, optic chiasm, optic tracts, geniculate bodies, and optic radiations. So this is a diagram showing the gross anatomy of the visual pathway. You can see the visual pathway begins from the retina, then goes to the optic nerves, and they relate the thing are related to the optic chiasm, then optic tract. They go to the lateral geniculate body, then there's optic radiation going to the visual cortex, which is in the occipital cortex of the brain. So orbit, extraocular muscles, and appendages of the eye. Each eyeball is suspended by extraocular muscles and facial sheath in a quadrilateral pyramid-shaped bony cavity called orbit. Each eyeball is located in the anterior orbit, nearer to the roof and lateral wall than to the floor and the medial wall. Each eye is protected anteriorly by two shutters called the eyelids. The anterior part of the sclera and posterior surface of lids are lined by a thin membrane called conjunctiva. For smooth functioning, the cornea and conjunctiva are to be kept moist by tears, which are produced by lacrimal glands and drained by the lacrimal passages. These structures, eyelids, eyebrows, conjunctiva, and lacrimal apparatus, are collectively called appendages of the eye. So this is a diagram showing eyeball and its accessory structures. So that's all about the structure of the eye. Thank you.